go. So, I'm guessing most people have heard of React. I don't know how many people kind of checked it out. I think the biggest challenge with presenting this was trying to figure out a way to do it in a way that didn't seem overwhelming. Because it's a pretty big library, and as I'll get into it here in a second, there are some things with it that if you start to read, if you go online and Google React, your mind can be blown. And I just wanted to figure out a way to show you the simplest way that it works, and then kind of layer on from there. So, and then I ran into the problem last week where all the stuff I wanted to do, I couldn't really cram into an hour. So, I think probably the best approach is I'll go through and do an intro. I'll give some of the basics of what React is, and then we'll see if we want to go on. If we want to continue on, we can do a second series down the road where I can show you all the different components that you can build into React. But I think what I've got now is a basic, good 101 view, 101 overview. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript and all that kind of stuff, it's not as intimidating. So here are the topics we'll go over today. We're going to just say what the heck is React, right? So there's all kinds of libraries out there. What is React and where does it stack up with everything else? Is it something that replaces Angular? What are the pros of React? What are the cons? And then some of the jargon that you use in React. What JSX is, what React Native is, what Redux is, what immutable JS is. And these are all the things I wanted to go over but really couldn't cram into an hour, but I'll kind of give it an overview of it. Some basic tips when creating them, and then we'll kind of go over some code. On site in the card here, I have a link. So I posted this in general. The link to the notes are here, and the link to the Bitbucket repo when we get to the code is there as well. So first and foremost, let's go to the top here. So let me kind of blow this up a little bit so you guys can see it. Is that good? Maybe that? Nice huge words. So what the heck is React, right? First off, React is not a JavaScript framework. So it's just simply a JavaScript library that helps you build modular UI. That's Facebook's intent with it, and that's all that it's supposed to be. It's just supposed to be a way to create components easily. So there's no routes, there's no controllers, just views. So it's not an MVC framework. It is just the V in MVC if you want to look at it that way. So React's basic philosophy is that components trigger events, e.g. after a name is input into a field. That event can then be listened to by a model. React does not have a model built into it. So you could use Backbone, you can use whatever model du jour library you want to use. And that's the whole purpose of why they built it this way. The model can then trigger an event. And then the view can respond to the model's event to re-render. So one way to remember that is that data flows down into the components and the events flow out and upwards. So think of it like dependency injection for components. So you have an app-based container and it injects all the dependencies down, and then those components can bubble up events so that the components don't have to know about each other. It's a really great way of decoupling your views, which makes them a lot easier to debug, especially when you get into really complex applications. So probably people are like, okay, they hear me talking about React. We spent all this time on Angular. So does that mean that our goal is to replace Angular with React? No. So comparing React to Angular is like comparing Bootstrap to Ember. So those who don't know what Ember is, or actually it's kind of like comparing Bootstrap to Angular for that matter. Bootstrap is a UI library. Angular is a JavaScript framework. React is more like Bootstrap than it is like Angular. It just happens to have a little more JavaScript to it, obviously. So React is just a UI library for building components. So since React only represents the V in MVC, you could potentially use React as the view layer in Angular, which a lot of people have done actually. So a lot of people are like, I don't like the way directives work in Angular. I love the way controllers and scope and all that kind of stuff works. I like the two-way binding in Angular. So you can easily use React components inside of Angular. So what are the pros? Okay, so the pros of using React is that data travels down. In short, this is the same benefit as dependency injection and object-oriented development. So you are always setting the properties of the components, and the components are immutable. So what that means is you're not really supposed to change the state after you push it down. So you say, here's your name, and then we want to change it. The thing containing the component changes the component, not the component itself. That might sound a little weird, but it's a lot easier to debug and trace things down because you don't have all these random side effects that happen when you have the components managing their own data like that. The virtual DOM means that the UI only updates when it is actually changed. This leads to super fast rendering time. So this is one of the biggest things that came out with React. So React basically says you have the DOM, which is a pretty complex thing, right? So and anytime something changes in the DOM, it has to traverse over the whole DOM, and all this other stuff happens. So what React does is it keeps a JavaScript object that represents the DOM. And it says that if you have 1 million components on the page, but only one thing changes, we're not going to render all the other 1 million things and just re-render them exactly the same they were. We're just going to re-render that one thing. So the more components you have on the page, the more efficient React becomes. It has awesome garbage collection, memory usage, and performance. I've got a link there if you guys want to check it out. It just kind of does some benchmarks of the virtual DOM in React versus Angular versus Mithril versus a couple other JavaScript libraries. Go ahead.
Quick question on the virtual DOM. Now, I know Angular automatically updates the UI whenever something an object changes. Does React do that?
Does it automatically update? Yes.
It does automatically. You don't have to tell it to do the update.
Correct. So there's a render function, and the render function gets called, and we'll go into that and show you the code example. So and there's some more complexities that I'm not going to get into in this particular intro. But you can do all kinds of things. You can handle events like right before the component is rendered, right after it's rendered. You can kind of jump in and do all these cool things before and after. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to focus on the render function, and that's where all your state is managed and everything. So when we get into code examples, I'll show you how that works. But yeah, when you do the component mounting and all that kind of stuff, you can do complex data binding that way. So you can do two-way data binding in React. It's not recommended, and I'll show you why. But it is possible to do. So, and there are times when maybe you want to do that. So, especially when you're not having parent-child relationships, when you have like a component way over here that has nothing at all to do with the ecosystem, and you have two components that want to talk with events, then you probably want to do an external event. But there's a whole other library called Redux that's designed for that. It's not part of React. It's something someone else wrote to handle that situation. So you can render your views on both the server and the client. This is one of the big, huge advantages of React. So what that means is you can pull in a React component from Ajax, and it'll work with your stuff that's on screen already. So like in Angular, for example, you usually will load up something, and I'm assuming here because I'm not an Angular expert, so Michael and Nick, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe with Angular, you pull in some data, and then you'll have to make some kind of call, or you have that weird blank state, which is why you can't have like meta tags and all that kind of stuff. You do like a weird little hack to get those meta tags and stuff like that, so it works like Facebook and Twitter. So people have found hacks around it and all that kind of stuff. But Facebook has libraries for PHP, Java, Node that allow you to do server-side rendering of the components. And you can dump them on the screen and have them interact with JavaScript. So that's a pretty interesting thing you can do with it. It makes modifying and reusing UI components super easy. Vue.js does this too. So it's the same kind of concept that Vue.js was going for. It's backed by Facebook and powering their site, so it's not likely to disappear anytime soon. Just like Angular with Google, right? So Google's backing Angular, Facebook is backing React. It's not going to be going anywhere anytime in the near future. And keep in mind, it's still not a 1.0 release. What I'm showing you is version 0.14. So Facebook hasn't even come out with version 1.0. But even with that being said, it's already in use by Facebook, Netflix, Airbnb, and Yahoo are some of the major companies currently using it. What's that? And Trello. Yeah, I didn't know that. But they have a big community online, so there's a ton of people out there, hyping up React. And there's a big community online to go out and get help if you're working on it. As it's not a framework, it can be used with other frameworks and libraries such as Angular, jQuery, Backbone, Vue, etc. So there's pretty much any of those things you see there, including Bootstrap, including Google's material. People have made React, Angular, React-Vue, React-Bootstrap. It's all out there for you guys to check out. So what are the cons? All these great things. What are some of the bad things about React? React is only concerned about the view. So there's nothing related to data modeling or routing or anything like that. If you're looking for a golden hammer to solve all your JavaScript woes, React is not the answer. Okay. Now with that being said, like I said, there's no router, but someone has created a component called React Route, and it works like a way you think a router works. So you can hook in, and you can say basically when I go to this route, I want to load this view and all that kind of stuff. But React doesn't bundle that in automatically. It allows you to pull in and compile your things as you want. Because it's only concerned with the view layer, it means that gluing the other parts has been a bit chaotic during the early adoption. Again, we're not even at 1.0 yet, so a lot of people have reinvented the wheel. So you'll see React Router, but then you'll also see 6 other people have done something similar to it, right? So it can be a little intimidating when you come into the field to figure out, okay, which one of these am I supposed to use? It doesn't come bundled with an event framework, so a lot of people have reinvented the wheel there. So if you go into Facebook's documentation on React, they have what's called the Flux concept. And Flux is a way to manage events. Well, some smart person said, that's great and all, but I think I have a better way of doing it. And they created a library called Redux. And then Facebook came out and basically said, hey, you took what we were going for and did it even better, so it's kind of like the universally accepted way of doing events. So when you get into complex, what we're going to show you today are some simple events. When you get into complex events, you probably want to use Redux. So that's something I'd like to dig into in the next presentation. React is a large library for not being a framework. Okay, so Angular, when you load up Angular, you're getting all that stuff. React has a pretty big footprint considering it's just used for the view. I mean, it's not super huge, but considering what it's used for, it's pretty large. Documentation is not the best, so the learning curve can be steep. And I really think, and I put that in bold because I really think it can be steep if you're trying to do everything at once. It intimidated me because when you get into most of the tutorials, you're going to look about Babel, ES6, Webpack, Browserify, all that kind of stuff, Gulp. And if you're not familiar with any of that stuff, it's going to be like, oh my gosh, I got to do all this stuff just to get React going. And no, you don't. So what I'm going to show you today is how to get going without knowing any of that stuff. Down the road, again, if a second version of this, we could show you how you use all those libraries to make working with React even easier. So with that in mind, it's not something like you want to start with MyPraise or Samos. You probably want to go out there, hey, it's a new fancy shiny thing. Let's use it on a huge project that has a time-sensitive, launch date. But if you're doing some kind of like side project at home, you're making a little to-do list app or something like that, it's a great way to get started with it. So there's also no native support for IE 8 or below. And that's native support. I believe there are other people who have gone out there and made some backwards compatible things. So if you're looking for something that needs to support something below IE 8, slap the client, first of all. But second of all, that's not the thing you want to use. Okay, so let's talk about some React speak. So what I mean by this, the same thing like in Angular, we're talking about scope and directives. There's things that are always unique to a framework. The terms you'll hear a lot are components. And the basic way you're looking at these is think of them as custom HTML elements. So you could have a component called video player that you'd start at frame 30, right? So the whole thing about declarative UI is that you're showing the intent. So it's not wrapped in a bunch of divs and span tags. It's saying, I want to have it. I mean, just looking at this, if you had no idea what React was, you could imagine what's going to be rendered there, right? That's cool. Some kind of video player, right? Same thing here, or a like button that starts off with 100 likes, right? Or a login component, right? You can imagine something called forgot password or something like that. So the big thing here is to follow the single responsibility rule. Each component does one thing and one thing well. So just like anything else in the world, you can find bad examples on the web where someone's creating React components that do a gazillion different things, and they're missing the whole point of modularization, right? So the best thing to do is to take these views and break them down into little components and think, how can I break this down to the smallest thing? Just like with a function, right? If you're writing really good code, your functions should be as small as they can get. So if you have an if-else statement, for example, if you're really modularizing your code, you would say if, call some function, else, call some other function, right? Because that function that you're calling should only be one thing. Your components should be very similar to that. So don't build a list and the AJAX call to fetch that list data in the same component. First build the component and then use that component inside the data fetcher. So what do I mean by that? So if you have a list of users, you would create a whole other component whose job is to fetch the user information. So that you can then inject that into the user list. So all your user list has to worry about is that it's got some kind of list of users. It doesn't care where it came from. And what that's going to do is when you get into front-end testing, it's going to make testing components a lot easier. That's a whole other series we could do on how to test components with React. So props, mad props, yo. So props are a way to initialize component state. So up here, you can think about these the same way you would like attributes on an HTML element. This would be a prop, started frame. Likes is a property, right? So if you have an input field box, the value is the property of that input. So they're declarative attributes. They're immutable, right? So once you inject them in, they're not supposed to change, right? They can change, and I'll show you how that works. But they're not really thinking that things are going to change. It's a way to initialize the component. And it's accessible inside the scope by this.props. So in other words, if using our started frame example, you would access that inside React via this props.startFrame. And then another way I looked at it for those that are familiar with object oriented programming, you can think of props as your public properties that you have in an object. Okay, so prop types. I didn't really get a chance to go into this on the code example, but it's a really cool concept, and I wanted to kind of just give a highlight of it. So prop types will allow your properties to be strictly typed, which is really neat. So you can say that if I have an age of a person, that it's a number. So kind of like your coerce thing you were talking about in Vue.js. This is like automatic coercion. Like behind the scenes, when you use prop types to describe your properties, you can force it to say, I want this property has to be set. So using our video player, if it said start at frame, if we wanted that to be set all the time and didn't have a default value for it, we can make it required. So if someone tries to use that component without setting that property, it'll throw an error. Events. So events are a way to use to communicate updates and changes to a component. And you can think of that just like you would like an on-click or anything like that. So what React does is it takes all the native out-of-the-box HTML events and just puts a thin wrapper over it so that they're all standardized. But all your common things you have like on a button, like on click, on update, on change, whatever you want. All those properties are pretty much available. The state is the mutable data of a component. And it's so just like you have this props to access the properties, you have this state to access the component state. So if you like a photo, the photo state will now change to liked, right? So you can basically, then you can do things in your rendering. So you could say, if this state equals liked or whatever, or if this state liked equals yes or whatever, then do X, Y, and Z. Managing state can get complicated, so rather than reinvent the wheel, it's best to start off with a community-supported library, such as Redux, which was based on Facebook's Flux theory. And I have a cartoon intro of Redux that helps to explain it, which I thought was pretty good. And again, you can kind of think of state as the private data. So this is stuff the component's going to manage. Once you send in the configuration, it'll manage its state however it sees fit. So you typically have a root component, just like you would in Angular. So you have like an app component or something like that. And that will act as your view presenter, or your main application controller. And that container component manages state by pushing data down. So as the events come up, on user change, it will push it down so that the components can react to whenever a user changes. Okay, and that allows you to determine which of the components you want to update. So maybe you want some that hold stale data for whatever reason. It gives you the flexibility to do that. So another thing you'll inevitably get into with React is JSX. JSX is the part inside the render function that looks like HTML. So it's going to look like you have HTML inside your JavaScript, basically. And there was some kind of, backlash in the community about that. Like, are we not supposed to be mixing HTML with JavaScript? This feels weird to me. I like it. I do wish it was more like Vue. I like the way Vue.js kind of puts it into a separate file. So there are pros and cons against it. There are people who argue that say, I like having it in my JavaScript so I'm not bouncing back and forth between two files. Once you get used to it, it's pretty simple. So I think in probably version 1 point something or 2 point something, they're probably going to move that out into separate. I'm thinking they will. I would like to see that because that's what I really like with Vue. That's one of the things I personally like better about Vue than React. So some tips. So one of the things that threw me off at first is when you write these, you're so used to using class equals or you're using Bootstrap or something like that. the class attribute or the class property on a element. It's different. In this one, it uses class name, and that's because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Okay, so JSX gets translated into JavaScript, and class is a keyword in the English version of JavaScript. And make sure to put the slash, obviously, on self-closing tags. Contrary to popular belief, JSX is not required. So if you don't like the way that stuff looks, you don't have to render your components that way. I put a brief blurb here about React Native. React Native is a whole other thing with React. It allows you to create mobile apps using React. And compared to, it's got some amazing rendering speed compared to things like Ionic and stuff like that, and PhoneGap. So it's pretty neat. Again, it's still in early adoption. So not quite ready for prime time yet, but there are people who are using it in production.
Can you share code between React and React Native, or are they pretty separate?
I haven't really dug too much into React Native. I imagine you can because the architecture looks the same, but I have not played around with React Native personally yet, so I don't know the answer to that.
It's probably like React with APIs for native system calls.
Yeah, like the components are called like iOS something or other, so like you can use specific components for iOS and Android. Yeah. But you could always, with that in mind, you can always create your own wrappers around those. So if it's called like iOS drawer and Android something or other, but they basically do the same thing as some kind of navigation at the bottom of the screen, you can call it bottom drawer, and then just basically React. So you can say if device is Android, then render this. If it's iOS, then render this. I've kind of already hashed over Redux. But a basic overview, Redux helps to manage how components interact with one another. And I'll put an asterisk on that and say it's really meant for, again, components that seemingly have no relationship to each other. Parent-child relationships, when you're communicating down and up between the parent and child, the out-of-the-box thing, which I'll show you today, works fine. When you get into complex scenarios, that's when you want to look at Redux. So the basic concept is components are given callback functions, which are called whenever a UI event happens. The callback functions create and dispatch actions based on the event. Reducers process the actions computing the new state, and so on. So it can get a little complex. I wouldn't dig into that until you've done the basic stuff here that I'm going to show you. Immutable JS, that's a library that someone created to force your properties and stuff to be immutable. It's just a way to kind of enforce the data integrity. Again, not required, but you're going to see that in a lot of tutorials if you go out and explore this a little bit further. So some tips, again, I touched on this earlier. Keep your components small. Follow a single responsible theory here. Just like functions and classes, you want your components to do one thing and do it really well. When you do that, it's going to make it easier for other developers to understand what's going on. It's easier to share and easier for your components to be reused across multiple applications, which is really the whole goal of React. And I give a kind of a little example of what that might look like. That's using ES6 syntax. I don't use ES6 syntax today because, for people who haven't used ES6 yet, that can look a little confusing. So you can manage state in components, but the rule of thumb is you want to keep state out of components as a general rule. So, and whenever possible, just pass down properties and set data that way. And again, do not place any business logic in components. That belongs on the domain model and probably on the server somewhere. Right? So you don't want to be showing your business logic in your JavaScript code. You should only really be using rendering logic in components. So some of the warning signs that you're violating that is if you're doing validation and calculations inside your components. And then here's a crap ton of links. These are ones that I particularly have looked at that I thought were helpful. So it's not like a garbage dump of bleh. These are actual things I actually reading up on how to present React that I thought were pretty helpful. So this is kind of finding the signal through the noise there a little bit, and still there's a lot of stuff there. And then below that are some links for Redux. Okay, so next step, we're going to look at some code. Okay, so. Like Mr. Fusty, I kind of started off with just Laravel. You don't obviously have to use React with Laravel. I use it because it's what I know. You can use it with Spring, you can use it with Node, anything you want. So And I've done this really dead simple. There's a welcome. This is like the index page. All I'm going to do is all my changes on here. I'm not even getting into like Laravel routes and stuff like that. So this is sort of like basically a single page app. It's just a very, very simple thing. I'll go into, we're going to do some basic things that will kind of illustrate how it works. So to start off with, this is initial state. When you load up Laravel, this is what Laravel looks out of the box. So first thing we'll do is we'll so here's our empty slate. So I took all the default stuff you see with Laravel to strip it down to the basic concept. So we haven't done anything with React yet. This is just a blank HTML page. All right. So the only thing I did is I put an ID of app on here because that's basically we're going to say we want to take this single div here and we want all the React magic to happen inside that div. Okay. So we'll check out step 2. All right. So what's going on here? All right. So first of all, FB me, that's Facebook's way of allowing you to get the latest version of React. So I've got React and React DOM. These are the 2 things that you need to basically get started with React. I just throw the script tags on the top. I actually added a meta tag too for UTF character. And I still have my div ID of app. I've just taken what was in there out of it. And now I'm using JavaScript. So I'm not using JSX at all. To create a class, you say react.createClass. The only thing you need is a render function at the bare minimum. Without any kind of JSX, you say React create element. I'm creating a div element, and then I'm passing in the value of hello world into it. Okay, and then down here, I'm saying now take this hello world component I've created. Hello, that's the hello world. That's what it's referring to. And then document get element by ID app, which is right here. This could have said foobar and foobar for all that is concerned. So I'm basically saying take this component that I've created and attach it to this. All right. And that's going to look like this. Hello world. That is all you need to get React working. So you're going to go online, you're going to see all this other crap, but that is all React is in its simplest form. Okay? So let's move on to the next step. So this is the bare bones React example. Wait, I think this is this. Okay, sorry, hold on a second. I think I just did the same thing. Okay, so here we go. So now we're going to introduce JSX. So I've changed this from JavaScript to JSX. Okay, everything else here is the same. The only thing we've added was the JS transformer library, right? So that's so that Facebook, or that so it knows how to handle these HTML tags inside the JavaScript, right? So we're still on the same thing. We're saying, but now we're passing in properties, right? So we're saying hello, and then we'll let that be customized to whatever we want. So now we're saying React render the hello world component. We're going to pass in the name Jables, and we're going to attach it to the ID app. Okay, so I can come over here. Hello Jables, and of course I can do that. Just change that to ethod if I wanted to. Hello ethod, right? So that's us using our component. This is where we define the component, and this is us using it. So it's actually just running a div with that in there. All right. Oh, okay. So now we're going to do a user profile component. Okay. So again, I haven't added anything up here. All that's still the same. Just showing something a little bit more complex, obviously, just to show you that it's more than just a div tag you can render. So we're putting in a header tag. We're going to have the first name of the person, the last name, and then we're going to pass in a picture, a source tag for a picture, right? So user profile, first name is Jason, last name is Abels. Pic is, I just use my Google Plus picture, which is this incredibly long, ridiculous path. But that's just me being lazy because I didn't want to upload it somewhere and get that path. So I was like, an image I already had available, and I just right-clicked and got the source, right? So again, we just put it there, and now we can render that out. So again, it's on the same thing. We just created a new tag called user profile. So we can create these tags whatever we want. We can call it FlizzyBub, var FlizzyBub. These two things would match up. So whatever we use here is what we want to use here. If these weren't the same, it would obviously give us an error, right? If I call that FlizzyBub, it would say you're trying to render a user profile, and I don't have a user profile tag to render, right? And I'll show you what that kind of looked like if we did do that. Oops. There we go. Basic one-on-one stuff. So again, if I change this to right. Okay. What happened? What's going on? All right. So it's going to tell us over here, user profile is not defined. So we're trying to use a tag that's not defined. Pretty simple.
Yeah. Want me to tell you what the problem is?
Oh wait, let me do this. Let's see what I did differently. Okay. So this is showing us how to compute properties, right? So we had first name and last name. So let's say we wanted to not have to do that all the time. Anytime we want to use someone's full name. So we can create functions. And we can say this full name. When we call this full name, it's going to return the first name plus a space plus the last name. Okay? So here we pass in the first name and last name. I also did what's a better practice, as you guys could see on the first time I did that. It's kind of hard to read when you're scrolling over. So when you have more than two attributes, the rule of thumb is you want to just break them off into one line each. Makes it a lot easier to read. This is going to do exactly the same thing. If I come over here, refresh. Again, same exact thing.
Your workflow is always create your div that you're going to stick it in, give that div an ID, create your component, and then render the component with your properties.
Right.
I'm just summarizing myself so I know what's happening.
Yep. Yep. And in a few minutes here, we're going to get into showing you how when you have more than one component, how that interacts and everything. But yeah, I usually will break out, and I'm going to show you the next once we get in. Whoops. Okay, so this is showing us how properties are immutable. So when I talk about that they're not changing, what does that mean? Okay, and how properties are different than state. So we still have the same thing. We still have the full name function. The only difference is we put the H1, we put the image, and now underneath that, we're gonna have a button that when we click it, our intent is to increment the number of clicks and show those. Right? But I'm going to show you how doing it this way doesn't work. So your intent is I want to have a button, and every time you click it, the counter is going to go up. All right. So what this is saying is this is an example of an event in React. So we're saying on the click, we're going to call this on button click, which is this function, and then we're going to take the clicks property and increment it. That's all we're going to try to do. All right. And down here now we're setting the clicks to 0. So we're initializing the state to 0. All right, so let's see what happens when we try to do that. So there's the count. Can you guys see that? Click me. Oh crap, nothing's happening. Okay, so even though we're trying to increment those properties, it's not changing because it's only meant, it's immutable. It doesn't change. That click count only is used to inject the data in. And that's to protect your components from any kind of weird component over here doing something crazy to your component, right? So it's a way of your component safeguarding itself. Okay, so with that in mind, then how the heck do we do that? So if we do want to show the click count, how do we get it so that you can change the count?
Is there a state object in scope?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, and that's what we're going to show you right now. So now we're going to introduce component state. So good looking out. So everything here is the same. There's a few things we're adding though, right? So first of all, I'm going to show you the component. So just to show you, we can change that number to whatever we want. We're going to pass in the number 5. So we're going to start with 5 clicks. We're going to pretend like we have 5 clicks. Now we're going to show you, we're going to add 2 buttons, an add and a subtract. So when we hit add, we want the count to go up. When we hit subtract, we want the count to go down. So we have 2 on-click events. When we click the add button, we're going to call the add click function. When we call the on-click button for subtract, we're going to call the subtract click function. And again, we define these right up here. So add click, pretty simple. We're going to say set the state. I'm going to say the number of clicks is going to equal to the current state of the clicks plus 1. And I could have done plus there. I just kind of did it just for whatever. Subtract click, same thing, we're just subtracting 1. All right. And the other difference is we're going to set an initial state. So what we're doing is we're going to say when we initially start up the component, we want the click state to be whatever the property that's passed in for the clicks value. We're doing parse int because it's coming in as a string, and we want to show it as an integer and not a string. So I'll show you what it looks like if we didn't do that. Okay. So now let's check out what that looks like. Refresh, add, subtract. All right, pretty straightforward. Now let's see what happens if we didn't do this parse int bit here. This is the same thing as your coerce in view.js.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's going to treat it as a string, right? So anybody have an idea what it's going to do?
6111.
All right, great.
I know it's effective.
Yeah.
Oh, then it turns into
That's weird.
Right.
Wait, now I haven't
Right. So yeah. All right. So that's showing you why that's important. Now again, what I didn't have time to go into for this presentation is if we define the prop types and we say that clicks is an integer, we wouldn't have to do this crap. And we could say if it's required, if it's always an integer, and you can define your own prop types. You can add your own validation to it and all that kind of cool stuff. So
I notice there's no reference to get initial state. Is that like overriding?
yeah, so this is an internal thing that Facebook is doing. So there's a couple of these defaults. So there's render, there's get initial state, and again, I don't want to go into all of them because there's component did mount, there's component will mount. Component will mount is called before render is called. And it's saying when your component's about ready to render on the screen, if you want to do some pre-rendering kind of stuff, you can do it in component will mount. After component did mount, is it saying it's rendered and it's already on the screen, now do you want to do something? And typically what those two functions are doing is when you use your own custom event management system, that's where you'd like remove events, so you don't have like garbage collection of all these events handlers hanging out there with the components removed off the screen. Or if you want to do some garbage cleanup. So when the component's removed off the screen, if there's some other kind of cleanup you want to do, maybe you're, whatever kind of garbage collection you want to do in JavaScript, you can do it inside those cleanup methods. But I will say this, if you're doing too much in there, you probably want to rethink about what you're doing. Right? So try to keep it as simple as you can. Because if you're doing stuff in there, you're probably doing things that either another library can solve, or you're probably putting too much stuff into your component. You need to simplify it. Um, ah. Okay. Now we're going to show how components can interact with each other. So this is going to be a little bit more complex, right? So now I'm adding some CSS stuff in here. So let me show you what we're trying to do. So we just want a basic user list. And when we click on that person's name, we want the view to change over to a user detail view. We're going to show the person's picture, their name, their title, their phone number, and their specialties they do. Okay? And so this is going to kind of show you how you can interact with models. And you don't need any fancy background libraries. You can just use a plain old JavaScript object. Right? It doesn't have to be anything fancy. And that's kind of what I'm going to show you, the simplicity of it. So first of all, let me show you how to think like React, right? So you look at the smallest thing, right? So this is a list, right? This whole thing right here is a list, but this is a list item, okay? So we're going to call this component a user list item, and all that's basically going to be is someone's name. That's all it is. That's all that crazy component does. A user list component just iterates over a bunch of list items, and that's all it's going to do. Then we have the user list page, which just acts as a container for that. So you notice the pattern here, user list and user details, they're similar, right? So these are going to be our two page objects. These are our two page views. User list page, user details page, right? So these two things have something in common, that they have a name. So this one's name is user list, that one's user details, and they display some kind of view. That's all that page is going to do, right? Then inside the user details, we're going to create this out into one component that has an image, a name, a title, a phone number, and a list. We could even sub-break those down. I'm not going to do that for here, but if you really want to use that image somewhere else, you can create a user avatar component. You can create a specialties component if you wanted to use that elsewhere. I didn't do that because in this context, it didn't make sense to break it out in that kind of. It could be making it more complex than it needs to be. But if you really thought you would reuse this phone number part, you could totally break that off into its own component. So we'll see how we render that. And I think this is kind of getting into what you were mentioning a second ago, Ryan. So same thing here. All we have is the app, right? I added some basic styles. I'm not using Bootstrap or anything like that right now. It's just some basic stuff. I didn't add any other CSS other than some basic things here. And so first we have an app component. And the app is going to contain those other two components. The app is also going to be responsible for, when we click on the user list, we want to show the user details. So the app is going to manage that event, right? So the app is saying, we need to bubble that event up. We want to change the page. The app component is going to be responsible for doing that. So we want to initialize, so the app's initial state, we're not going to show a back button. That's what back false is for. The page name is going to be user list. And then we're going to generate for the view the user list page component. We're going to pass in the users, which are going to be passed in by a props users. And then when a user is clicked, we're going to call this view user details, right? So notice this could be anything, right? So we could call a server-side page inside this function. We can make an AJAX call. We can do all kinds of stuff. For this particular, and that's the way you can decouple your components, right? So we can make this do whatever we want. It doesn't care where it gets what's happening. It just knows it wants to view some kind of user details, right? And that's how you decouple your components. So, and then for when we return the state, the users by default, there's not going to be any users on a page. The current page will be the initial page we set, and the previous page, is going to be the initial page as well, right? Because it's the default one that's loading up. So when we view user details, we're going to change the state. So the current page is now the user detail page, and we pass in the user as passed into that. So we're going to say that user, we're going to pass it into that component. We're going to show a back button, so we can go back to the previous page. We're going to show the page name as user details, and the previous page is going to be whatever the current page is now, right? So we're on the current page, we're going to go to the next page, and we're saying before we leave, we want to set the previous page to where we are now. So we click the back button and go back there. All right, and so this is all our app is going to do. We wrap it inside a div tag, and we're going to say that, and this is where we use state instead of props, right? So we're going to say this will change whenever we change that state. So there's going to be an h1 tag, and it's going to show the current page name. There's going to be a link, and I ended up not using the icons. I was going to do bootstrappy stuff initially, so you can actually ignore all that. Remove that technically, but so it's going to say if the current page back is set to true, then show it. Otherwise, hide this element. And if it's visible, then when we click it, we're going to call the onBackClick function, which is up here. So when we click the back button, we're going to say the current page is now the previous page. The previous page is now the current page, right? So we're going backwards. So we're going to swap those two around. And so these pages are these objects here. So that means that we can be anywhere in this app, and the back click will work the same way. It doesn't matter. So we only have 2 pages, but you can imagine like you had 7 or 8 pages, and wherever you have the back page, that way the page that you're on doesn't have to manage what was coming before it. That's what this function's purpose is for. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we need to figure out, okay, so we're rendering these user list page and user details page. Okay, what's going on with those? So I also created a row component just to show you how you could wrap, say, like bootstrap components. So I'm creating so instead of saying div class name equals row all the time, I just want to type a row tag. Okay, and so this is how you could wrap a bootstrap function. This prop children is something that's native to React. And that means whatever you put inside the row tag, just display that inside this thing here. Okay, so let's look at the user list page. So, pretty dead simple component. All right, so all we're saying is we're going to have a class name of page user list, and I put that there just in case you want to render it somehow, whatever. And then we're going to show the user list. So if we go back to, so we're saying on this page we're going to show the list. This is our page view. This is the list view. So here's our list view. So we're going to take the users that's passed into the page. We're going to pass that down into the list. So we're going to say the users you received, we're just going to pass that down into the user list. And then if someone clicks on one of those items, we're going to call the onUserClick event handler that was passed in. Okay. So let's go back up to the user list page when we define it up here. So again, here's so the users are coming in from here. And when we're saying when that user click event happens, we're going to call the view user details. Okay. Am I losing everybody? We're still on board? Right. To be clear, in order to simplify this, this is all on one page. Down the road, you would break these out into their own files and everything, right? So this normally wouldn't be all over the place like this. I'm doing this just to kind of show you that I didn't want to overwhelm people with trying to figure out how to store things in folders and all that kind of stuff, okay? This is showing that you can do this all on one page and you just want to fiddle around with it. You don't have to worry about routes and all that kind of crap. So our user list component is defined up here. So we define our onUserClick event as whatever's passed in. So we're basically saying when the user does click it, delegate it to whatever the event handler was passed in. We don't care what happens. We just know that we're going to pass that click event out. And then the users, which are passed into it, we're going to say for each of the users that are passed in, we're going to render a user list item. The key for it is going to be the user's ID. The user is going to be the user. And the onUserClick event is going to be whatever was passed into it, right? Which is what we define up here. So when the user clicks, call this function, which is going to be whatever was passed on into it. So it's showing you how you can take something from way up top and pass that handler all the way down. And then to render it, all we're doing is just a UL with the users. So we're just taking a UL and we're passing in the user list item. So what's the user list item component? It looks like this. It's just a list tag with a link. I use this here. So if we wanted to, we could call a server-side script. We could handle this in-app. It doesn't care. This component doesn't care if it's a single-page component or a server-side render component, is what I'm trying to get at. It just knows that that's the route it could pass, right? So you can make this whatever you want. You can even make it a div tag and not make it an anchor tag. Or you can create another component called link. And inside that link component, you can do things to determine whether or not you want to show an anchor tag or div tag based on any kind of thing, right? So all kinds of flexibility you can do there. And so when the person clicks on this user's name, we're going to bubble that event up to the user click event. We're going to set the user value to the property of the user ID passed in. And we're going to show their pic and their first name and last name. All right. So when we click on the user details page, or when we click on that name, it bubbles all the way up, and it's going to call view user details, at which point we're going to now change the view state to the user details page. So let's look at to see what that looks like. The user details page again, it's going to be pretty simple. It's just a div with a user wrapping around a user details component. So it's the page is the container. It's just a container component. So these are usually very small. It's just a wrapper to wrap around it. So in a testing framework, you could pass in like user could come from a web service. It could come from a database call. It could any kind of thing. It might be maybe using Firebase on the client side. It's coming from that. It doesn't matter. The user details doesn't care where it's getting the user from. It just says, I got a user property, you pass me the user object, we're good. Doesn't matter. So now we look at what the user details looks like. And now this one's a little more involved, right? So here's the row component I created. Again, that's just on dev because we don't keep typing that same redundant crap over and over again. As a designer coming in here, you got a pretty good idea what that is. I don't even like these span things. I would want to call those column, like COL, but I'm just running out of time, really. I would prefer calling those like COLs or something like that, so it's a column. And inside there, we're going to have the image. And now we do user pick large, so just so you can put CSS modifiers on your components. So we're just going to take the same picture and make it like a little bit larger. We're going to show the user's name. We're going to show their title underneath that. And these are just basic H3 H5 tags, right? So this is going to be weighted a little bit heavier than this one. We're going to drop down another row and show the phone number. So again, just as a rehasher, we're making this, right? Making a big picture, name that, although I couldn't get it to work because I'm not using Bootstrap. So this is going to fall underneath here. Okay, bear with me. And then underneath that, we're going to show the phone number, and then we're going to have another row and show the specialties. And then we're going to have a list showing the specialties. So here, it's just saying, this is like saying that's a specialties component. So where does this specialties get defined? Right up here inside the render. So we're saying specialties is take the user's specialties, and for each one of them, create a list item. And just render the specialty name. That's all we're going to do. And that's it. That's all the user's details page does. Now, here represents what our users are going to be, right? So it's just a very basic JavaScript object. Nothing fancy. We're not using backbone and all that crazy crap. You can, but for this, it'd probably be overkill. But you can make these whatever you want. So we have an ID. Obviously, if this is coming from some kind of back-end system, these are probably auto-generated, whatever. We're hard-coding it to prove a point. First name, last name, title, their phone number, the specialties, and the pic, right? And now we go down and we say, now we want to render the app. And the only thing we're injecting into the app is the users. So throw that into the app, and now the app will handle dispersing that users out to the components. The components bubble their event up to the app layer. Okay? So what does that look like? There's our user list. Right? So if I click on my name, there's the user details, right? Here's the back thing that we only show if we told the page if it's visible. I click it, it's gone now. I can't go back from this page because I don't want to, right? Now I click on Beavis Jones, and again, it's just showing you it's loading up the other thing, right? So just to kind of show you, let's look up a picture. Give me a name, a celebrity or something. Kardashian? Kim Kardashian?
Mila Kunis.
Wesley Snipes.
Okay. Oops. That's not what I wanted to do. All right, there we go. Can I write copy image? Copy image address, actually. All right, so we'll go and create Kim Kardashian real quick, just to kind of show you how we would do this, right? So let me paste it here so I remember the picture. We're gonna make Kim Kardashian real quick. Not 2 divided by 3. Specialties.
I can do it. I'll do it. Great, Jay.
Right? Okay. And now we'll take this. Okay, so now we'll take. Get rid of the HTTP. You guys notice why I'm doing this? So that way, it doesn't matter if you're on a secure page or not. It'll always render. If anybody's run into that problem on Google Chrome before, it's a good way to make sure that it will render the same way regardless if you're on a HTTP page or HTTPS. Right? So, well, hopefully this will work. So I don't look like a fool.
It's not IE5 compatible.
Right. There's Kim Kardashian, right? All right. So, let's see. I think I did a step 10. Oh, whoops. Yes.
So that JavaScript object, that just gets generated on the server side?
Yeah, you can. Well, the point is you could generate the client side. You could do what I did. You can hard code it. You could have a like a Firebase system, a client. So you can have a client side server that, or like use a web service like Firebase. So you're calling some kind of remote. So Firebase has a whole JavaScript library you can use. So you're not even calling a backend server. Or you can have a PHP server, a Node server. What I would recommend doing is the same thing you would do in Angular. I would create a user service and create, user find all, user find by ID. But the point is, you could then stub that out and test your components without having to worry about making AJAX calls inside your components. So you're just decoupling it, which makes it easier to test. It's kind of overkill for a small thing here. But when you get into things like MyPraise and stuff like that, you've got all these components all over the place. It really helps with debugging, and you're basically saying you're controlling it. So you're saying the data path, just like the way dependency injection works. You're explicitly saying, here's how I want my components to define, and here's how I want it to react to events, or not react to events for that matter. And then I just did a little style with Bootstrap here, just to show you could add Bootstrap library or whatever. Well, because I just yeah. So in 2:30, that is exactly 1 hour. All right. So that's all. That's the basic intro to React. So, you guys have any questions? Yeah. So my main thing was here to show you how approachable React is, because I don't think the learning curve is that steep when you just start off this way. It can get steep if you start looking up stuff about Redux and Immutable and how to manage your event libraries and event stores and all this other crap, and how to get it to work with Babel and ES6. Because some people, you can define the components using ES6 and all that kind of stuff. So if Nick, you're probably already familiar with that. For anybody who's already familiar with that kind of stuff, it's going to be even easier. Because a lot you can do, instead of doing what I do with React class, you can say, my component extends other component. And you can do all this really neat stuff with ES6 and Babel and all that kind of stuff. You can take advantage of all the cool stuff that JavaScript is doing. You can bundle your components in the background. You can say, when you're loading your components, you can say var user details equals require user details. So you can use the require kind of concept that you were using with view.js, for example. And there is a React view, or a view React, or something like that, where people will combine React and view together too. So taking the best of both of those worlds as well. So I've got all the links out there. There's a kind of a curated list of what I found, because if you just type React.js, you're going to get overwhelmed with stuff. Start off that list, go out and explore. and I think you guys will have fun with it. It's really easy to get started. Once you kind of get the basic concept of it, it's really easy to do.